Silver Springs is running at 384 cubic feet per second. For most of the last century, it averaged 820. That is not a dry season dip. That is less than half of the spring that made Florida famous, measured in June of 2026, sitting at the bottom of the low range for that month. 20 miles southwest of Ocala, Rainbow Springs is down to 532 against a long-term average of 677. Then, on June 9, 2026, the agency in charge of Silver Springs did something that made those numbers stop looking like weather. 16 of the 18 counties in the St. Johns River Water Management District closed out June short on rain for the previous 12 months. Baker County was short more than 20 inches. The district's groundwater index sat in the 21st percentile, which is the low range. Marion County, which holds both springs inside its borders, is under forced watering limits from two separate water districts at the same time. At the district's board meeting on June 9th, staff showed the water conditions report and told the board it would take 33.23 inches of rain over the next 3 months to end the drought. That is not a forecast. That is several hurricanes. Later in that same meeting, item 4 on the agenda, the board voted on water use permit 11,339-8 for the Murphree Water Treatment Plant in Gainesville. The permit raised how much Gainesville Regional Utilities is allowed to pump from the upper Floridan aquifer, from 30 million gallons a day to 34.592 million gallons a day, running through the year 2056. Every member voted yes, roll call, and nobody said no. But here is the detail that tells the real story. According to the state of Florida, pumping groundwater is barely part of any of this. The official answer is that Silver Springs has lost about 32% of its flow since the 1930s, and that of that loss, 13.3% comes from years of below normal rain, 15.5% comes from underwater plants growing thick in the river channel downstream, and 3.5% comes from pumping, 3.5%. That is the number the whole set of rules is built on. It was 1878, and two men named Hullum Jones and Philip Morrell were working in Marion County with a dugout canoe and a sheet of glass. Jones cut a hole in the bottom of the boat, fitted a glass box over it, and pushed out over the head spring. What they had invented was the glass bottom boat, and what they had started by accident was the oldest paid tourist stop in the state of Florida. They could do it because the water was clear all the way to the sand, 80 feet down in places, and because the spring was pushing so much water up through that sand that the bottom looked like it was boiling. At the time, Silver Springs pushed out more water than any spring in the United States. More than 500 million gallons a day. 25 separate openings feeding one river. Mammoth Spring alone, the largest of them, gives roughly half the flow of the entire Silver River. By the 1930s, the gauges put the average yearly flow at 820 cubic feet per second. That is the number everything since gets measured against. Then came the wells. In 1950, about 100 miles south of Ocala, Florida found out exactly what the bottom of this looks like. Kissingen Spring sat just south of Bartow in Polk County, on the upper Peace River. It pushed about 20 million gallons a day. People swam there. There was a hall for dancing. Families drove out on weekends the way families drove out to Silver Springs. Starting in the late 1930s, the phosphate mining companies around Bartow began drilling into the Floridan aquifer and pumping hard. The pressure in the aquifer dropped. The spring got weaker, then weaker. On February 19, 1950, Kissingen Spring stopped flowing. Not for the season, for good. It was the first major Florida spring lost to groundwater pumping, and it was written up the following year in a state geology report. The history sign at the site today, in what is now Mosaic Peace River Park, describes what happened in one very careful sentence. It says the spring stopped being a tourist stop after the groundwater was captured for other uses. Captured for other uses. Now, zoom out, because the thing you have to understand about a Florida spring is that it is not a hole in the ground with water in it. It is the visible end of something huge. Under most of the state sits the Floridan Aquifer system, layers of limestone holding an amount of fresh water that is hard to hold in your head. Rain falls, filters down through sand and clay, and enters that limestone. The limestone is full of tunnels, dissolved into the rock. Water moves through those tunnels under pressure. The area of land that drains into one spring is called its spring shed. Silver Springs has a spring shed that covers more than 1,360 square miles. Rainbow Springs has one covering about 735 square miles across Alachua, Levy, and Marion counties. The two of them sit almost back to back, split by an underground line that moves depending on how wet the year has been. Between 1950 and 2011, the two of them together put out a middle figure of 1,425 cubic feet per second. That is about 920 million gallons a day from two spring groups sitting inside one county. Rainbow's share of that middle figure was 687. Silver's was 734. Two rivers born full-grown out of flat ground. And this is not a story about two unlucky springs. In 2011, the United States Geological Survey put out a long-term study on the Ichetucknee, another large spring group in North Florida, and found flow had dropped by about 23% between 1900 and 2009. The rate of loss was speeding up, from about 0.8 cubic feet per second per year mid-century to about 1.1 after 1970. A separate study of 32 major Florida springs found that between 1991 and 2020, flow fell, while sodium and chloride levels climbed by about 7 to 11% every 10 years. Salt working inland, into springs, in the middle of the state, far from the shore. This is the part that matters. A spring is not fed by how much water is in the aquifer. It is fed by the pressure of the water in the aquifer. Think of a bathroom sink with an overflow hole near the top rim. The sink can be 3/4 full, and nothing comes out of that overflow. Nothing at all. The water only pours through when the level rises above the lip. Drop it a few inches, and the overflow goes dry, while the sink is still holding gallons. A spring opening is that overflow hole. The pressure level in the aquifer, what water scientists call the potentiometric surface, is the water level in the sink. Lower it, and the spring does not shrink evenly. It falls off a lip. Kissingen did not run out of water. The aquifer under Bartow still had water in it in 1950. It still does. What Kissingen ran out of was pressure. That is how it works. And every fight in Florida right now is a fight about who is lowering the level. There is also a version of this that almost nobody outside the research world talks about. A peer-reviewed study of Silver Springs found the average flow fell 32% in just the 12 years between 2000 and 2012, while the average water pressure under the spring shed dropped about 0.14 meters and the spring pool itself rose about 0.24 meters. Small numbers, both of them, inches. But run those inches through the overflow lip and the flow falls apart. The same study found something odd. The working spring shed, the actual patch of ground still sending water to Silver Springs, has been getting smaller every year since 1989. And the new water soaking back down has been falling since the 1970s with a sharp drop in 2002. The spring is getting less water. It is being fed by a smaller piece of Florida than it used to be. Dr. Robert Knight spent more than 40 years on this question. He is the founder and former director of the Howard T. Odom Florida Springs Institute in High Springs, and he has run close field studies at more than 20 large Florida springs, including both Silver and Rainbow. His position, put in writing and on the record, is that the agencies whose job is to guard the springs are instead complicit in the ongoing decline of them because they keep handing out pumping permits while the flows keep falling. When the St. John's District put forward its minimum flow rule for Silver Springs, Knight summed up the district's reason for the drop in one word: ludicrous. Pay attention to this next part, because it explains everything that follows. In April of 2017, the district passed minimum flows for Silver Springs. A minimum flow is the legal line where more pumping counts as seriously harmful. The rule protects 94% of the spring's natural flow, which means it allows a 6% hit from pumping. At the time, pumping already in place was put at 3.5%. So the rule, as written, made room for about another 10 million gallons a day to be pulled out of the ground. The district's own numbers said Silver Springs would fail to meet those minimum flows by 2025. Not might fail, was expected to fail. which is why the rule came bundled with a plan to prevent that, a set of projects meant to put water back. Over on the Rainbow, Southwest Florida Water Management District wrote its rule the same way. The minimum flow there is a long-term average of 649 cubic feet per second at the Dunellen gauge, built as a 5% cut from a long-term average of 683. After adjusting for pumping, daily readings on the Rainbow near Dunellen this summer have been running in the low 500s. Now, that is a short-term reading against a long-term standard, and the two are not the same thing. A dry June does not put a river in breach of its minimum flow, but it does tell you how much room is left between a normal year and a bad one, and the answer is not much. If you are finding this useful, subscribe. We cover water crises, aquifers, and earth science events like this every week with the full picture you need to actually follow what is going on. By March of 2026, Marion County residents were living under two sets of watering rules at once. The St. Johns District had called a Phase 2 severe water shortage. On the southwest side of the county, Southwest Florida had its own limits running. In the district's February report, Silver Springs was logged at 476 cubic feet per second. By June, it was 384, down another 52 in a single month. While that was happening, something else was moving the other way. The Ocala metro area, which is all of Marion County, was named the fastest-growing metro area in the United States by the Census Bureau. Not once. 3 years in a row, including a 3.4% growth rate between July of 2024 and July of 2025, in a year when 310 of the country's 387 metro areas slowed down. The county went from 375,892 people in 2020 to 442,260 by the middle of 2025. That is 66,368 more people in 5 years, a 17.65% jump. At the peak of it, about 45 people were moving to Marion County every day. Every one of them drinks, every one of them flushes, a large share of them water lawns, and outdoor watering alone can be up to half of what a household uses. All of that water comes out of the same limestone that feeds Silver and Rainbow. Now follow what happens as the pressure drops, because it does not happen everywhere at once. It happens in order. First, the smallest openings go. A spring group like Silver is not one opening. It is at least 25 of them, at different heights. The high ones stop first, quietly, with nobody standing there to see it. Second, the river changes. Less flow means slower water. Slower water means dirt settles instead of being swept downstream, and sunlight reaches surfaces that used to be scrubbed clean. Put that next to nitrate levels in Silver Springs that the state's own cleanup work put at more than 3,100% above the natural level, and you get algae growing over the spring bottom. Then you get an official finding that plant growth in the channel is holding back flow, which becomes a reason to blame the drop on something other than pumping. Third, the towns. Dunellen sits at the bottom of the Rainbow River, where it meets the Withlacoochee. In the spring of 2026, the Southwest Florida District reported that the Rainbow River was giving almost all of the flow into Lake Rousseau, because the Withlacoochee upstream had almost nothing left in it. Total water coming into that lake was running at about half of the year before. The Inglis Bypass Spillway, which keeps fresh water moving into the lower Withlacoochee, was running at 35% of what it can carry. And it shows up in the one thing these places were famous for. In the upper Rainbow River, you can see sideways through the water for over 200 feet. By the lower river, that drops to somewhere between 38 and 47 feet. That is the same water, 5 miles apart. The Silver River runs about 5.5 miles to where it joins the Ocala, and from there the water goes into the St. Johns. So a weaker Silver Springs is not just a Marion County problem. It is less fresh water going into one of the longest rivers in Florida, in a system that already has a dam downstream blocking fish from moving. Fourth, the county. Marion County's water systems, and the people who live there, are drawing from the same aquifer that feeds the springs. In a county that is adding more people for its size than anywhere else in America, during a drought that its own water managers say would take several hurricanes to break. Fifth, the economy that sits on top of all of it. Silver Springs State Park covers about 4,660 acres. It was named a National Natural Landmark in 1971. The the glass-bottom boats still run. Rainbow Springs was made an aquatic preserve in 1986 and an outstanding Florida water in 1987, and the state park there opened in 1995. Both were named in the 2016 Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act as outstanding Florida springs that need extra protection. The protection is on paper. The flow is on the gauge. They are not saying the same thing. Somebody saw this coming and said so and was not listened to. In 2017, when the St. John's Board was getting ready to vote on the Silver Springs minimum flow, Springs groups told the board straight out that a rule allowing a 6% hit on a spring that had already lost 32% of its flow was not protection. St. John's Riverkeeper called it a plan to cut the flow of Silver Springs even further. The board adopted it anyway, and the district's own paperwork said it would fail by 2025. It is now 2026, and the spring is at 384. Here is what the state is doing about it, and it is not nothing. In Ocala, the Pine Oaks Wetland Recharge Park is a 33-acre man-made wetland taking cleaned wastewater from 2 city water recycling plants, plus stormwater from an old holding pond. The gain is expected to be 3 to 5 million gallons a day, soaking back into the upper Floridan aquifer, plus a cut of 59,000 pounds of nitrogen pollution a year. There are stormwater upgrades with filter material. There is a county grant from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection to fix septic systems, because septic tanks were found to send more than 20% of the pollution into both the Silver and Rainbow systems. Real projects, real money, real cuts. Now put 3 to 5 million gallons a day soaking back in next to a pumping system that Dr. Knight has described as close to 5 billion gallons a day across the Floridan aquifer, with hundreds of new permits handed out every year. The math does not add up. And there is one more thing worth knowing, because it shows how big the proposed answers had gotten. A regional plan called Water First North Florida would have piped cleaned wastewater from Jacksonville's water company west into the Suwannee Basin to soak down through wetlands and refill the Floridan aquifer. The price was about $1 billion in July of 2025. By February of 2026, it had reached $1.1 billion. And that figure did not include the pipeline itself or buying the land. On May 12, 2026, State Senator Corey Simon said that the project was being canceled in its current form. About $20 million had been stripped out of the House and Senate budget plans. All 12 counties in the Suwannee District had come out against it. But the St. John's District had set aside about $125 million for that project. When residents stood up at the June 9th board meeting and asked straight out whether that money was still in the budget and whether the contracts with the consultants had been canceled, the board did not answer the question. The Sierra Club's position is that the plan was only put on hold, not scrapped. So this is where it stands. Silver Springs, once the biggest producer of any spring in the United States, is running at less than half its long-term average. Rainbow Springs is below the long-term flow that its own rule was written to protect. The aquifer that feeds both is in the low range and has been for months. The county on top of them is growing faster than any other metro area in the country. And the official answer is still that pumping accounts for 3.5% of the problem. Which sentence is the real one? If the drop is mostly rain, why has it kept going through wet years and dry ones since the 1930s? If it is mostly water plants growing in the river channel, what made the channel slow enough for them to take hold? Why did a district facing an extreme water shortage approve more pumping in the same meeting where it showed the drought numbers? And if one of the biggest springs there is can be cut to half strength in 90 years, while every agency involved reports that it is following the rules, what does the paperwork look like the year one of them stops? Kissingen was following the rules too. There was no rule it broke. It just stopped one morning in February. As of the end of July 2026, the St. John's River Water Management District is still under a Phase 3 extreme water shortage. The Suwannee District to the north pushed its own water shortage order out through December 31st. The rain shortfall across north-central Florida stood at 18.69 inches over 12 months at the end of June. The gauges at Silver Springs and at the Dunellen Bridge are still reporting, every day, on schedule. And at the bottom of Mammoth Spring, under the glass panels of a boat design that is 148 years old, the sand is still turning over. Water that fell as rain before any of this started, still finding its way up through the limestone, still pushing that sand into small clouds that settle and rise again, a little slower every year.